Hello everybody, I am Jared Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and on today's vlog, I will be discussing part 2 of my maternal great-grandparents. Now, if you haven't watched part 1 yet about my paternal great-grandparents, I highly suggest going to check that out. And in this one, I'll be going over my maternal great-grandparents. Starting with my maternal grandfather's parents, Morris Nunes Vaz and Jennie Epstein. Morris Nunes Vaz was born May 21st, 1897 in London to Abraham Nunes Vaz and Jane Moscow. His father was a Sephardic Jew whose family had lived in Amsterdam for many generations. His mother was an Ashkenazi Jew whose family had also lived in Amsterdam for many generations. Although on his mother's side, she did have a great-grandmother who was also Sephardic Jewish. So Morris was about 5/8 Sephardi, 3/8 Ashkenazi, all having come from Dutch Jewish families. Both of his parents had also been born in London because Morris's grandparents were the ones to immigrate from Amsterdam to London. But his parents had actually moved to Michigan before he was born from London. Then they had a child there. They moved back to London, and that was when Morris was born. The family would eventually move to Boston, where Morris was raised. But while in London, Morris had actually attended school even as a very young child. Morris's father had worked mostly as a cigar maker, a shoelaster, and a boot maker, but he also worked as a vaudeville actor, dancing, singing, doing comedy, and he went under the name William H. Mackney. And when they were in the US, Abe even helped manage his niece's dancing career. Morris also had an uncle, his mother's brother, Sam Moscow, who worked for Columbia Pictures. So because of this, Morris grew up in a family that dealt a lot in the entertainment industry. And he eventually got a job through his uncle, Sam Moscow, where he was working as a movie booker, a plugger for movies. And he worked mostly for Columbia Pictures, but also the story is that he worked for Universal. My great-grandmother, Jennie Epstein, was born March 19th, 1897 in Boston to Meyer Epstein and Annie Silicon. Jennie's father, Meyer, had been married previously and had a daughter named Dora through that first marriage, but his first wife died young. He would remarry and then end up having a son, Joseph, in 1895, and then Jennie in 1897. Unfortunately, in 1904, when Jennie was only 7, her father contracted pneumonia in November of that year and would die only 5 days later. Her mother would eventually go on to own a grocery store where both Jennie and her brother Joseph worked. And there's even a family story that someone once stole a can of tuna or something from the store, and my great-grandmother actually chased that person down and was able to get back the item that they stole. At the same time, Jennie and her brother Joseph were also working at a hardware store called South End Hardware. And it was during this time that she ended up meeting my great-grandfather Morris. But I'll let my great-grandmother Jennie tell you that story.
Jennie, where did you meet Uncle Morris?
Oh, he was working for, I think it was Universal Films.
And you were
And a niece, not a niece of mine, a relative of mine, a cousin of mine, Frances Barron, I'll never forget
I remember her name.
And
yeah.
she always raved about Morris. Wants to meet you. So I stopped by because where I worked in the South End Hardware, they weren't far from me. So I'd stop in to see her. And when I saw him, I think he dated me or something. Oh, when she talked to me about him, I said, oh, that kid.
Yeah.
And it developed.
After they were married, Morris and Jennie would eventually move down to New Haven because Morris's work brought him down there. They would own multiple movie theaters in the area, and many family members followed them because Morris was somewhat of a patriarch in the family, and he would make sure that all the different relatives had jobs. By the 1940s, Morris had purchased the Shubert Theater in New Haven with his business partner Maurice Bailey. And during the time that the family owned it, there were many famous Broadway plays which would premiere at the Shubert Theater. In the late 40s, he decided to move to California, where he would begin work on neo-noir films. And he brought many of the family with him once again. And many of the family members would work on the films, and even my grandfather and my grandmother were part of these, and I have photo albums from some of these shoots. While out in LA, Morris was also beginning to develop what would have been the first multiplex in the United States. Having owned multiple movie theaters out on the East Coast, I'm sure this was something that was in his mind for a while, and while he was in the process of getting that completed in Los Angeles, he passed away on January 21st, 1948 from a heart attack. His body was sent from Los Angeles to Boston by train to be buried in the family plots in Roxbury Mutual Cemetery, which is a cemetery that his father and his uncles and aunts had actually been part of founding. The family story is that Morris's brother, Robert, who was mostly known as Uncle Bobby, sat with Morris's body on the entire train ride to Boston. After Morris's death, the family moved back to New Haven, although a few cousins did stay in Los Angeles. And Jennie would still stay as an owner of the Shubert Theater, working alongside with the Baileys. The family sold their portion of the Shubert Theater in 1976, but Jennie would live on for many, many years and passed away on August 8th, 2006 at the age of 109. One interesting thing that I've thought about when researching my great-grandmother is the fact that her father having died when she was 7 and her dying at the age of 109 meant she lived 102 years without her father. And I don't know why, but for some reason that fact has always made an impression on me. Now we will discuss my maternal grandmother's parents, Jack Ecoff and Mary Kaseno. Jack Ecoff was born Jacob Joseph Ecoff on September 30th, 1895 in Alliance, New Jersey, to Marcus Ecoff and Fanny Dudas. His family was part of a Jewish agricultural society in New Jersey that was founded in 1882, with his father and his paternal grandparents having been one of the founding families of that colony. The family owned a farm in Alliance where Jack grew up and learned how to tend the land. Jack was the youngest of 4 children, but when he was 14, one of his older brothers, Raphael Israel Ecoff, died tragically when a dentist pulled the wrong tooth and an infection set in. Jack's future wife, Mary Kaseno, was born May 5th, 1898 in Manioc, Pennsylvania, to Harris Kaseno and Rachel Skavatsky. Mary's parents had immigrated from Kiev to Manioc, Pennsylvania after hearing about Manioc from some friends of theirs. On the ride over, Harris would decide to change his name from Kazanovich to Kaseno because he had a hard time dealing with all of the enumerators on the ships, and so he just felt Kaseno would be easier. In Manioc, the family owned a clothing store at 4227 Main Street, and this was a really big part of Manioc, so they were a very successful store, and eventually would expand and grow into the store that was next door as well. But during the summers, the Kaseno family would actually vacation in southern New Jersey, and they would stay at the Ecoff family farm. It was on this farm that Jack and Mary fell in love with each other, and I have cassette tapes from my great-grandmother Mary talking about how my great-grandfather would drive her around on these dirt roads through Alliance and would introduce her to all of the different people. There's an interesting family story that's also been passed down that Mary's father didn't actually want her to get wed to Jack because he was just a farm boy and Harris had somebody else in mind who was a businessman of sorts. But by 1920, Jack had actually moved out to Philadelphia, living with his sister, her husband, and his older brother Martin, and he worked as a furniture salesman at Snellberg's in Philadelphia. But very soon in that same year, Jack would actually start working with his cousins Jack Mills and Irving Mills in their music publishing business under the name Jack Mills Incorporated, but what would eventually become known as Mills Music Publishing. Now, 1920 was a very big year for both Jack and Mary because that was the year that Jack really began working with his cousins. It was the year that Mary's parents died, with her mother dying around April and her father dying in November of that year. And it was also the year that they were married. An announcement in the newspaper in January of 1921 also mentions that Jack and Mary, after being wed, would go and vacation in New York City. Jack's work with his cousins lasted for the rest of his life, and in the 1940s he would actually be named general sales manager of Mills Music Publishing. But he was really there from the beginning, with the brothers having founded the company in 1919 and Jack joining on just a year later, representing their interests in the Philadelphia markets. Over Jack's 40 years of working with his cousins in this business, he saw the company transform and influence American music forever, with the company bringing out huge acts such as Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Benny Goodman, Hoagie Carmichael, and just so many other big names. A big part of Jack's job working for Mills Music was he would often represent the company at a lot of educational conventions for music, and Jack became an extremely well-known figure among the music industry. Years ago, when I got in touch with my cousin Stanley Mills, who's the son of Jack Mills, he told me about how my great-grandfather Jack would actually take him on the road to show him different parts of the business. Stanley would eventually go on to become famous as the music publisher who brought the chicken dance to the US. But one thing that I have heard over the years was that Jack Mills and his brother Irving Mills really did not get along, and they had a lot of fighting between them. And my great-grandfather Jack was said to have been the one to keep the peace among them and to have kind of been the liaison between them to keep the business running. Eventually, Jack and Mary would move from Philadelphia to New York City, where they would live in Rockville Center. That way, Jack could work out of the famous Brill building, where the Mills Music Publishing offices were located. On July 2nd, 1963, Jack would die of a heart attack, and just 2 years later, his cousins Jack Mills and Irving Mills would sell their business for $5 million. Soon after Jack's death, Mary moved down to New Haven to be near her daughter's family, and would later go on to San Diego in the 1980s, also following her daughter's family out to California. Mary passed away on March 6, 1999, at the age of 100, just 2 months shy of turning 101. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It's completely free to do so. And you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at GeneaVlogger. I'm the GeneaVlogger. I'll see you in my next video.